Hey everybody, it's Andy Kushner, host of the Wedding Biz. And as I am recording this, I'm getting ready to go to New York City to interview Colin Cowie for a second time. So excited, going to be at his office for this. I've got some great topics I'm going to bring up. Also going to be interviewing David Stark for a second time. Another wonderful planner and designer. Very excited about David. David is also going to be recording with me as the guest co-host for an upcoming The Next Level for Cindy Novotny. So I'm really psyched about hanging with David as well. And then when this actual interview today is released, I will be in San Francisco to interview Lori Ahrens, very popular planner and designer. Also going to interview Natasha Miller, founder and CEO of Kushner Entertainment, who has a very unique story. Well, I want to mention last week's episode, which was Lynn Easton of Easton Destination Events, and that is a second interview with Lynn. Really amazing conversation. As many of you know, a luxury destination planner and designer, and she shared her perspective about branding yourself and choosing a partner team for your events, and shares some of her secrets for creating a high-touch event. And we had an elucidating conversation about pricing that you should not miss. So, in terms of this morning's guest, let me first say, because of all the travel that I'm doing, plus an unusually busy winter season for my entertainment company, Kushner Entertainment, I am caving and doing what many have been asking me to do for a while, which is to have an interview about me. Now, let me say, I've been interviewed on a number of podcasts, and so I decided to publish the most recent one, which is by Mary Swaffield of Wedpreneur. And I liked how she handled it because she asked some really thoughtful questions, and I found myself organizing my thoughts as to what the common threads are of the more than 75 interviews that I've done of some of the biggest icons in the wedding and events industry. And I address things like cyclical struggles, dealing with anxiety and fear, which seems to be so inherent in our business, and also my changing perspective about how I look at the business aspect of our creative industry based on interviews that I've done, and so much more. So I really enjoyed Mary, and hopefully you'll enjoy this. And there will be no The Next Level episode with this because, well, it's about me. I don't want to talk about me with a guest co-host. That would just be too weird. So no Next Level on this one. So without further ado, here is Mary Swaffield of Wedpreneur interviewing me.
Hey Wedpreneurs, welcome to the Smart Business for Wedding Pros podcast. I am your host, Mary Swaffield. I am so thrilled to be with you here today, and today we have an amazing interview with Andy Kushner. I know I say it's an amazing interview every single time, but honestly, guys, I have the most amazing guests, and I am so honored that they take the time to chat with me. I want to share a little bit about Andy. I'm going to give you his official bio here. So Andy is celebrated as a top 25 trendsetter by Modern Bride, and he exchanged corporate fame as National Account Representative of the Year for a Fortune 500 company to dominate the music industry through his passion come to life, Kushner Entertainment. He is a gifted storyteller, and he leveraged his relationships with top event planners and designers by launching The Wedding Biz, the only podcast for wedding and event professionals that exclusively features business transforming conversations with industry icons. Never one to rest on his laurels, Andy has recently taken his revolutionary approach to branding and marketing global via the Wedding Biz Podcast Network, podcast channels featuring the best in the wedding and event business. Andy and I are going to be chatting about all of the amazing icons that he gets to interview on his show. And guys, if you're not already listening to his podcast, I highly recommend it. I will link to it in the show notes for sure. But there are so many amazing things that we're talking about in this interview, and he has learned so much from all of these amazing event pros that he gets to sit down with. So without further ado, let's dive right in. You guys are going to love this one. Let's go. Andy, thank you so much for joining me today on the Smart Business for Wedding Pros podcast. It is such an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks, Mary. I really appreciate you having me on it. I think your show is great. So yeah, I'm excited.
For all of our listeners out there, as I mentioned during the intro, Andy is the host of the Wedding Biz Podcast, and it is always a thrill to be interviewing fellow educators and experts in the industry. Before we get started, though, Andy, can you share some of your background with our audience, what your role is in the wedding industry?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I have an entertainment company called Kushner Entertainment, and I have a handful of bands and strings, and it's a real high-touch service. So we tend to do kind of higher-end events, weddings around the world, and also corporate events, and sometimes wild stuff in Vegas. But most of our business is weddings, and so I started my first band called Sound Connection in the Washington, D.C. area, and eventually added more, Rhythm 6, Sound Nation, Pop Culture Strings, and I had a job at the time selling for IBM and Lexmark, and ended up leaving it and going full-time about 19 years ago, and did that for a while. It's really only recent that I got into the podcast side of the business.
That's awesome. Well, and I love the fact that you've been in business for a long time, because I think that that's really, really inspiring. But I'm curious, what inspired you to start a podcast? Where did that idea come from?
Oh, wow. Well, I got to go back a little bit because I have always loved listening to great speakers. And even when I was in college, I was at Boston University, I signed up for a lecture series just to hear people speak and how they express themselves, and the passion and the emotional, and how they, engage people to really pay attention and deliver this kind of a message. And even some really of the great comedians like George Carlin, Richard Pryor. These are more old school, but these are people who, it wasn't just jokes and one-liners. They were really delivering a profound message using this tool of comedy, to grab people and get them to really take it in. And so I always loved that. And I had a certain amount of experience just from performing. I played trumpet in my band, and a lot of times I'd get on the mic and talk to the crowd. So I enjoyed, believe it or not, doing that. I learned a lot about, how to get an audience's attention, how to hold it. And so I'm always thinking from an entertainment perspective. And so it was just literally like 3 years ago that a friend of mine said, you got to check out podcasts. And I didn't even know what that was. And I started listening to certain shows, not related at all to the wedding business, like Tim Ferriss and Brian Koppelman and Mark Maron. And I've always admired Howard Stern interviews, like of the last maybe 10 years or so. He's considered by even Barbara Walters and Dan Rather as one of the greatest of all time. So, but I started to listen to these podcasts on a regular basis and enjoyed the convenience that I could do it while I was driving, while I was working out, getting ready in the morning. And I got a lot out of these podcasts. And I, all of a sudden, it was like 2 years ago, I remember thinking, geez, I wonder what's going on in the wedding side, the wedding industry, when it comes to podcasts. And so I started to search. And again, this is like 2.5 years ago. There's a lot more today that exists. Mm-hmm. And there were a fair amount back then, but I looked at them and I felt that something was missing. I thought there was a hole in the market. I had this experience through Kushner Entertainment, my music business, of been really lucky to work with some of these icons, like Colin Cowie was the first one I worked with. And we did super multi-million-dollar weddings in the Bahamas and in Santa Ynez, California. And I started to meet and work with other people, David Tutera and Sean DeFreitas and Marcy Bloom, Preston Bailey, and Sylvia Weinstock. And, I started to experience these super, super high-level weddings. And I thought, well, given my business experience from a long time ago with IBM and Lexmark, where I was a sort of a consultant, I thought, what if I combine this love and passion I have for speaking and delivering a message and the entertainment experience, and along with just loving the idea of this kind of one-on-one intimate conversation that the podcasts that I listen to were, and what if I could stay at that super high level of just icons in the business and get their story and really go deep and vulnerable and find out, what is even aspects of their childhood. We don't want to go too far with these podcasts, but I wanted to get a sense of what was it in their childhood that kind of helped to form who they are today, and when was that moment when the passion to do what they do in the wedding business hit them, and then how did they do it? Did they start their own business? Did they work for somebody? Did they already have another job? How did they make the transition? And what were the pain points and what were the challenges? And did they feel fear? And how did they deal with all of that? And then I would take it further into once we got to that point, literally what is their process? When they're sitting down with a wedding couple and take me from A to Z, and they would. And And then even further, the ones who have scaled these really large businesses, like a Brian Raffanelli or a David Stark. I mean, I would want to get into that. How do you scale a business? And so I started with, I'm trying to think who the first kind of high-end person was. I think it might have been Sylvia Weinstock, who, if some of you don't know, is a cake designer. Her cakes, and she's closed down her business, though she's still licensing at the age of 89. She's selling licenses. But she's an icon in the business, and she started hers at 50 and became super successful. Her cakes would average $25,000, $30,000 a cake. I started with her, and I had such a good time. I mean, there were some others that I practiced on locally, but in terms of that level, she was the first at that level. And then there's a lot more to the story, but I eventually was able to get access to a ton of people through a luxury wedding conference called Engage. Mm-hmm. And again, a lot more to it, but I was able to get to these people. And after I had a few names, I could name drop and basically start to get other people. So now I feel really lucky and grateful. I'm at the point where pretty much almost anyone will agree to be on the show when I go ahead and drop a few names from the past.
That's amazing. And there's a few things that you mentioned here that I want to unpack a little, and I love it. The first one is I love that you have a music background, fellow musician here. So I understand that love of performing. And when I listen to your podcast, I really get that sense of storytelling. And I think, from the perspective of so many people in the wedding industry, we see these icons and they feel sort of untouchable to us a little bit. And to hear what their stories were and how they got started and what their processes are is incredibly inspiring. And you're right, there is a big gap for that in the industry. And I think, it is just such a magical moment to hear these people that, for us, there are sports heroes in a way. That's right. To be able to hear them talk and tell their story and share so much information is really, really amazing. So I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mary. And, it's interesting. I appreciate that you said that you can get a sense of the entertainment from a perspective of storytelling, because, I was also working on songwriting and crafting lyrics. And so I kind of take that songwriting experience, but let's bring it back to the wedding industry. Those of us who are in this, and any position, whether you're a photographer, a videographer, a planner, a designer, and I would guess that most of your audience are probably more planners and designers. Mm-hmm. The whole point, one of the biggest lessons I've learned from interviewing so many of these people, it's been a year and a half, so I don't know what I'm up to, 65 or something like that. But one of the biggest things, or one of the threads that ties them all together, and they talk about it, is that they feel that their job is to get to know their client really personal, deeply connect with them so that they can tell their story, through an event, and sticking to the wedding, through their wedding. What can they do to catch these various, well, I would say personality traits of each of them, the couple as well, individually as well as a couple, because as a couple, right, there's these personality traits, and then to tell a story using all five senses. And Colin Cowie, which was an incredible interview I had with him last year, talked a lot about the five senses, addressing that at a party. And so it becomes very emotionally impactful when you can do that. And so that word you bring up, which I love that you brought it up, Mary, storytelling, that is the heart of what this is about for all of them.
I love that. And I am a huge Colin Cowie fan, have been from, the very first moment I started in the wedding industry. And his idea of designing with five senses, I've heard him speak about this before, actually really had a huge impact on my own design business. And I really took that to heart and was like, design is more than just the pretty. It is about the experience, and the experience for all five senses and for every single guest and couple that you work with. So I 100% love that he talks about that. And just to have that kind of sharing in this industry, I think sets us apart a little bit. And it's so inspiring. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. It really is all about storytelling. And with Colin, it was interesting. One of his first weddings, or the first wedding he ever did, was Hugh Hefner's wedding, which is just crazy.
No pressure.
Yeah, right. I don't know if the youngest people who are listening will know who he is, but he passed away recently, but he was a real icon in the world. You could look him up if you don't know who he was. But yeah, the very first party, first wedding he did was Colin wanted to, and you could hear this in the interview, but he wanted to create this also visual experience. I mean, like you say, it's all about experience. And so he came up with some ideas that I believe, when I heard it, were really innovative. And that's a big part of it too, is really, I'm kind of getting in another direction here, but is trusting your gut. And that's another thing that all of these people have developed a good sense of, is to really, rather than doing these cookie cutter events, and I'm going to give an example by that of something, but rather they're really trying to almost, I don't want to say outdo themselves each time, but they're trying to do something different all the time. They're constantly trying to figure that out. And they're risk takers. I mean, there is a certain amount of risk that has to be made. I'm going to give a little example through the music business that I'm involved in. I do something I call entertainment design, and so with my clients, again, it's a very high touch service. We don't just send out a band video and price and then just show up and do what we do every week. But instead, I meet with clients like a planner, like a designer, like you do, and get to know them and try to find these ways to create an experience, like we're saying, that is really different from what they might have seen at someone else's wedding. And so that's a lot of what these people are doing. And so the example I wanted to bring up is that it's really frequent that I get a timeline from a planner ahead of time before I have this meeting that is just a cookie cutter template. And it's interesting. At the mid-level, most planners do have templates. And at the highest level, like these people I interview, and what I do with when I create timelines, because I actually do them, is that it's completely unique. It's each couple has a completely different personality. They have a different vision. They have different desires.
The true creatives in our industry have found a way to challenge themselves over and over and over again. And I think, like you said, that involves really getting to connect with their clients in such a deep level that there's no chance of it becoming cookie cutter.
Well, that's right. And it really kind of comes down to being a collaborative effort, with the couple, and so that they feel really involved and they feel heard and seen. And so even, this is interesting too, that I discovered, is that even the process of working toward the actual wedding night with their planner, designer, but them in particular, that in of itself is an experience. And so, and I don't mean to keep coming back to Colin, but since he's on my mind, since we're talking about him, even when a prospective client shows up at his office for the first time to meet him, there's an entire experience. He actually has somebody, an intern, who is trained up and sees pictures of the clients and gets a little bit of information and waits down by the lobby so that they recognize can you imagine this intern recognizes the clients showing up, goes up to them, greets them by name. They're blown away. Already the first touch, this is before they even meet Colin, is that experience. And then they get into the elevator, they come into the lobby, it's all glass. He has them, when they sit down before he shows up, they're facing a certain direction so that they can see this beautiful, stunning office. And he even has, if I remember correctly, on a silver platter, tea and macaroons with their initials carved into it. I mean, look, we all can't do this, but the point is, the experience of even meeting a lot of these people that I've interviewed and then working with them is like almost just as exciting practically as the night of the event itself.
I think that's really key. And we talk a lot about the client experience. And I remember hearing some similar stories about the way Preston Bailey works with his couples. And you're right, we can't all do that, especially earlier in our career, but we can always find ways, I think, to really delight our couples. And we talk endlessly in the industry, within the business side, about how do we set ourselves apart. And I think that if you focus on the experience your couples are going to have with you and find these ways to delight and take it to the next level, then you start to go on that path. You start to create an experience for your couples that, like you said, isn't just about what they experience on their wedding day. It's about what they experience in the process of working with you.
That's right. And, you mentioned Preston Bailey. He was on the show twice. And, an interesting thing about Preston, and I heard about this from some other people, even at the level that he's at, he is so humble. He is. And one of the things that he's really known for is how he makes each person feel so personally attended to. And even when I went to go interview him, the first time, just the way even before we started, he just sat real close. He leaned in, full attention. It's incredible. And so, yeah, this kind of extends itself into a lot of different areas.
It absolutely does. Well, so you've interviewed some of the most legendary wedding pros in the industry. Having heard from so many of them, have you ever started to feel some common threads, either in their background or some of the pain points they have? Is there anything that you're starting to hear and go like, okay, I'm starting to hear a common thread as we go through these interviews?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like we've already spoken about, personally connecting with each client and how important that is. And it's all about the emotion. And they all have different techniques. So they all really lead with that in terms of some of them will go out with their clients for meals, and they're like looking at how they're dressed. They're looking at what they're eating. They're looking at what they're drinking. Some of them, like Matthew Robbins, will go do social events with his guests, and he's checking everything out. They'll go to their homes and they're looking around at the colors and the furniture and the decorations. And there's so many ways to do this. I also want to say another connecting thread, and I think this is really good for all of us to hear, is that every single one of them, almost every single one of them, still has cyclical times in terms of the success. Well, I don't want to say success, but how their business is doing. Like Preston mentioned that just 4 years ago, he had a really rough year. Now, who would think that the Preston Bailey had a rough year? And there was no recession 4 years ago, nothing like that. And I've heard that from many, many people. Jess Gordon, who I interviewed too, talks about that. And well, a lot of people do. And so I think it's really important for all of us to know that these people are not, just sitting on some magical pedestal up in the air in some castle and making just tons and tons of money. And, once they get there, they've arrived. It's not like that. Like even Mindy Weiss, who I interviewed, and I think I released hers just a few months ago, something like that. Mindy was talking about how hard she still has to work, especially with the change with millennials now making more of the decisions and how different they do that. And she actually hired, I think it's like an 18-year-old, 19-year-old who came into the business to help give her a perspective. And so there's also that, being aware that the business is cyclical and you can't beat yourself up for it. Also, it was interesting to me that a lot of people kind of fell into it. I mean, God, I wish it was like that for me. I mean, for my music business, I worked hard and for years to make that thing happen. But it's shocking how many of the people I've interviewed they were whatever. They maybe helped a friend with a party and they weren't necessarily doing it as a job. They just were helping. And then other people were like, oh, gee, I really like, can you do this for me? And how it spreads. I mean, I'm like kind of envious. But I think that speaks to the passion that they have and that they were leading with their heart from the beginning. Another thread that I've also gone through, and it was David Stark who said it to me. He's one of the people that scaled really big, and also Brian Raffanelli, and I spoke with him about it. And both Brian Raffanelli and David Stark separately talked about how I basically said to them, well, how do you balance the art with the business? It's two totally different things, right? And I mean, I have a struggle with that. I think we all do as creative people. How do you handle the business side of it? Because these people have built multi-million-dollar businesses. And David said, well, geez, he was like real nonchalant. He said, well, I look at creating a business structure as a creative act. And that stuck with me. That changed me, actually. And I still have to work on that. But building your business, dealing with your business is a creative act. There's no need to look at it separately. And Brian Raffanelli, this knocked me out too. He said that he views running the business just as exciting and as much fun and as enjoyable as doing the planning and the designing, and that knocked me out.
I love that. I'm going to pause because I want to unpack.
Sure.
I took so many notes. There's so many great things here. I think it is really, really important to repeat what you said about all of these icons admitting that business is still hard. It is still hard. They work hard every day. I think sometimes, I hear from wedding pros who are kind of in the thick of it in the early stages of their career. And they're like, I'm going to keep working hard so that someday I don't have to work quite as hard. I find that to be exactly the opposite. when I first got into the event industry in general, I remember thinking, and I came from, like I said, a background of the music industry. I remember thinking, I thought musicians were dedicated, but these event people are crazy dedicated. And the more successful they get, the harder they seem to work, because it is a passion. It is an industry of passion. And they're constantly wanting to challenge themselves to do better. And so I love that people are still talking about the fact that it is hard work. This industry is hard work. And I also love that you mentioned that all businesses have up and downs, because, in the day of social media, it's easy to look at, so many of these icons and even just our competitors in our own markets and be like, what am I doing wrong? Business is slow for me this year, and yet they seem to be knocking it out of the park. It is really easy to buy into that misrepresentation of what our realities actually are. So I think that's really critical and valuable to hear. I know that when I've met Preston a few times, and he's always been really transparent about the challenges he's experienced in his business and the mistakes he's made, and how important all of those have been for him to grow both as an artist and as a business owner. So I really appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think it's really important for us to be aware of that. And, the other thing is that this business that we're in, this wedding industry, is so emotional for us also. And I think it's really important for us all to keep in mind that these inner struggles that we're all having and the fears that we have, that we're not alone. Everybody is dealing with it. And so Robert Fountain, whose interview we just released this morning, and he's a guy out of San Francisco who does the planning and design for a lot of the really high-tech giants of the world. These are people who are changing our world in the tech industry. And Robert was telling me that he always feels anxiety. He feels that all of us, all of the creatives in business, that it's part of our personality trait, is this kind of propensity to feel more anxious perhaps than most. And he talks about how he uses that to his advantage. And I'm like, yeah, please help me. Tell me how to do that, Robert. But he said that if he's not feeling nervous, then he's not doing a good job.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting. Yeah, so it's an indicator to him. And so he uses it as really as a motivator. He feels it's a friend, this feeling of nervousness, anxiety, and it keeps him on his toes, and he knows that it's motivating him. And so he has a different, it's all about our perception. I mean, that's the biggest thing here, is when we're going down that rabbit hole or we're having these thoughts, it's all how we perceive it. I mean, and it's so hard to switch that, to flip that switch, but we can do that. And one of the exercises I'm kind of doing for myself lately is when I start to have one of these negative thoughts, my mind is starting to say something. I try to catch myself, of course, number one, because it's even hard to do that. You just keep going and going. So catch myself, stop, and I try to reframe it. And I'm really working on that lately. Let me reframe some kind of a negative thought, like what Robert said. It's like, geez, I'm feeling fear today. And then I'll say, wait, hold on. Okay, that means I'm excited. What is it that I can do to feel better? I mean, it's interesting. It's all about that. It's all about perception.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating. I'm going to go down this rabbit hole a little bit with you, because this is a topic I'm quite interested in. As a former performer, I used to get horrible stage fright, like for weeks leading up to every performance, almost debilitating. And then I actually had an instructor who basically said to me, you're an artist and you need to learn how to use that fear, use that anxiety. It just means that you have something to lose, that you've invested your heart, your time, your passion into this. And that means that you are going to get out there and do your best work. But if you don't feel something, then you should be concerned, right? So I remember she actually referred me to a book, which I encourage everybody to read. It's quite old. I want to say it's probably 20 plus years old, but it was life-changing for me. And it's called The Inner Game of Tennis. And it really is all about that perception, that mental state when you're having doubts and anxiety. And it's a really powerful read. So I'll link to it in the show notes. It's a great read about this. But I agree with you that you're going to have those feelings no matter what, and everybody does. And I think it's up to us to determine how we're going to maximize that and turn it to our advantage and really reframe it to be, turn that negative into a positive.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna also add another book to the list. Since you
Yay!
did that. Yeah, there's a book called The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. The Obstacle is the Way. And basically talks about how we need to embrace the obstacle, like actually be thankful for it. I mean, who wants to have obstacles? But, when you read the book and really get deep into it, he's talking about how, some of this is obvious, but to be reminded, we are going to grow the most when we come across some kind of an obstacle that we then have to figure out and solve. And it's those obstacles that help us to grow and evolve. And it's just hard to keep that perception, again, because when it's happening, it's just, it's so awful. It feels so bad. And his point is that he talks about a lot of really very high performing people, whether they're athletes or business, and how some of the best in the world just kind of have this, almost seems to have this nonchalant attitude that, well, okay, this is in front of me. What can I do to make it even better? And that's one of the things I do, is that when I run into a real problem in any aspect of my life, whether it's personal or it's business, in order to feel better about it, I decide, okay, what can I do so that I later look back on this problem that came up and say, thank you, that was a blessing in disguise. It got me even further. And it's just being open-minded to it. And I think by being open-minded, kind of relaxes yourself, helps you to kind of ease into it and be open to seeing something you might not otherwise see if you're feeling nothing but fear and being uptight.
Oh, I love that. That's great. That actually reminds me also of a quote. I think it was Joseph Campbell, and he said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." And I remind myself of that all the time, that if I'm feeling fearful about something, there is a great gift or lesson or treasure or, personal or business growth on the other side of it. I just have to have the courage to go in there and be, like you said, open-minded to the lessons I'm going to have and the experiences I'm going to have from it. I also want to mention, you had talked about one of the guests you had interviewed, I can't remember off the top of my head, but talking about how business is creativity. And I want to unpack that a little bit too, because oftentimes I feel like as creatives, like you said, we look at the act of running a business as some sort of some sort of chore that we have to do in order to be allowed to create our art. And I have always been really passionate about business, and I am so excited that your guest said this, because to me, if we start turning our creativity inwards into our business, then the world has no bounds to us. So I really, really love that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of what we're talking about is to embrace it. And look, we've got to accept it. I mean, if you're going to be an entrepreneur and you want to make a living at it, it would be great if all we had to do is create. But, the bottom line is that money is important, in order to pay for a lifestyle that allows us to do what we want to do. And so, may as well try to look at it positively and embrace it and find a way to enjoy it. I think that's a big key to this is examine that. How can it be more fun?
Oh, I like that a lot. Okay, so changing gears just a little bit here. You have been in this industry for quite a long time. So I'm curious what the biggest change you've seen in the industry has been.
In the wedding industry itself?
Yeah.
Well, for me, I'll try to speak specifically and then generically. In terms of for me in the entertainment business, people who are starting to get engaged now, get married, did not necessarily grow up to bands. They grew up much more to tracks and these singers who, it's so much now is about dancing and how you look and sexuality and all. And I don't have any problem with all of that, but it seems that people are going or more interested in DJs. And I'm not knocking DJs, because we also book wonderful DJs, and a DJ can run a great party, but there's nothing like the energy of a live band, especially if the band knows it comes down to the same thing. If they know how to connect with a crowd, not just perform really well, but literally take a party and give people an experience. And so that's been more of a challenge. I have to do a lot more work in order to message that to potential clients. As far as generically speaking, there's this huge thing going on now, and this is not negative about millennials. I'm sure there's a lot of millennials listening right now, and I hate to even categorize and call it something like that. But let's take it a little further. Things are moving so fast now, and all of us, our attention span. I mean, this gets talked about a lot. I think it's down to like 7 seconds when you're looking at a website, like 3 to 7 seconds, something like that. People don't just sit and hang out with it. It's like you got to be excited, and something's got to happen constantly. And I'm finding that, I have a daughter who's 24, and I've experienced this through her eyes. But even myself and my friends, our attention spans are maybe not as quick and short as someone in their early 20s or teens, but it's shortening. We're all just getting used to all this stuff going on at one time, and all this stuff with the phones and quick access to anything and everything, and social media and the impact that has, which is good and bad. And so I would say the biggest change is really the speed at which we can get information now, and how there's just so much information that everything has to just be constantly moving, constantly exciting. You got to grab people's attention and move on and move on and move on. That's a challenge. But again, same as with everything else, we have to embrace that and figure out, okay, this is the world of today. And what do we do? That big word pivot, what do we do? And that's another thing. Every one of these icons talk about pivoting, every one of them. That's another reason for their success, is that they're able to do that. And it's the ones who get stuck in the old ways and start to fall behind. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's one of the biggest changes in how it's affecting the industry, is the constant rate of change.
Absolutely. And I think you hit upon something really important there. And I know, I've been in the industry now I've just passed my 10-year anniversary, which
congratulations.
I feel like, thanks. I really feel like there should be some huge party for that, by the way. But I definitely have sensed that, especially, I am a Gen Zer, which means that I grew up without technology, and then I was the first to embrace technology. And so even though I feel like I'm an early adopter in many ways, I still have struggled as things get faster and faster. And I have 2 teenagers, and holy man, do they ever move fast all the time. So I think you're right. We have to be really nimble, and we can't stop time. We can't change the way that things are moving. All we can really do is choose to adapt and go with it and make the best of it. And I think the most creative people will find ways to capitalize on it and make it work in their favor. So yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I also want to touch upon what you said about live music. As a former musician, for everybody out there listening, especially you planners, I'm just going to get a little plug in here. Encourage live music. I 100% agree with Andy. I work with amazing DJs all the time, but there really is nothing like the energy of a live band. And one of the shifts I'm seeing with couples these days is they care less about the details and really more about the overall experience. They're adventurers, they want a big experience, and really live music can bring that home in a way that is incredible. I often, when I plan weddings, will have a DJ and a live band just to mix it up. But I just had to put that little plug in because I feel like the need to support all the musicians out there is really important to me. So guys, go out there and hire some live music for your weddings.
Yeah, I love that. You said that right there with you.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're running out of time here, but I'm curious if you have, based on everything you've learned doing all of these amazing interviews, what is sort of the one key piece of advice that you would like to share with the audience today?
Wow, Mary, that's a tough question. I'm going to say the main thing is that you got to remember why you're doing this. It's so easy to get caught up in the difficulties and the challenges. And if you're at that point where maybe you have another job and you want to do this full time, or you are doing it full time, but you need to grow, and it's just really tough out there. I believe in finding ways to bring that passion back and to remind yourself why you got in it. And, you know, we're on this hamster wheel and I get caught up. Matter of fact, today was a really rough day for me. I mean, it was just nonstop, really intense. I did not leave my building the entire day. I have not been outside. And, you know, and today of all days is when I should have taken a break, even if it's just 20 minutes, to step outside, you know, feel the sun, take a little bit of a walk, see nature, get an outside perspective. Matter of fact, there's someone being released next Monday on the next episode, Allison Hotchkiss Rindercraft from Rinderconnect from San Francisco, and she is very successful, travels all over the world. She's got 2 businesses connected to the event industry, and she talked a lot. I asked her about balance, and I also like to help with women who have children. You know, how are they balancing it? These really successful women in the business, and you know, how do they look at that? And I was talking with Allison about that, and she said that in spite of all of this, the way that she stays grounded and calm is by putting into her schedule time to take nature walks. You know, definitely seeing friends and family, and she has a long morning routine with her daughter that grounds her, and she really sticks with it. And that's what I'm getting at here is we got to find ways to stay grounded, stay connected, because then it helps you to feel that passion again and not to lose it. And so that would be the biggest piece of advice that I can give is, you know, what can you do right now? Take a break. What can you do to feel better? And again, reconnect yourself with yourself and the planet.
I love that so much. So reconnect to your why. I think that that's really, really critical. Andy, thank you so much for being here today. Can you share where our audience can find you online, including your podcast?
Yeah, sure. The podcast is theweddingbiz.com, The Wedding Biz, B-I-Z. And of course, on any podcast app, just search for The Wedding Biz. Also, you'll find that there's not only regular interviews that that we release every Monday, there's also another segment that comes out at the same time called The Next Level, in which I have a co-host who's my marketing director, and we take the interview of the morning and kind of break it down into 2 or 3 highlights and deliver it as tactical strategies that you can use to raise your business to the next level. And so, you know, we have this discussion about the interview of the morning. You could find us on the social media platforms, especially Instagram, at Wedding Biz Show. Again, Wedding Biz Show. I not to give so much information at one time, I'm sure it'll be in Mary's show notes about this episode, but I also have a network called the Wedding Biz Network. And the first host, we're having Icons in the Business host shows under our umbrella, and it's Julie Sabatino, the stylish bride, who gives incredible tips, styling tips for brides, which is great for planners to be aware of too, because our brides can't always afford a consultant like her. So she gives these tips, and so all of that. And then the last one is, if you want to check out the entertainment site, it's Kushner Entertainment, Kushner, Kushner, Kushner Entertainment. But yeah, Mary, I want to thank you for having me on the show. I love this conversation. See, this was real. We got into the real stuff. That's what I love to do.
I love it so much too. And yes, I will link to all of those in the show notes for anybody who wants to check it out. And I really encourage you to do so. You know, I am a podcast addict. I listen to so many podcasts, not just in the wedding industry, but Andy's is definitely one of my favorites. It's one of the first ones I ever heard. So It is a true honor to have you here on the show today.
Oh, geez. Thank you, Mary. Well, I appreciate it too.
Have a great day, Andy.
You too. Thank you for listening to Mary's interview on her podcast that I appeared on. And be sure to check out her site, which is thewedpreneur.com. Again, thewedpreneur.com. It's also listed in our show notes. And you can listen to others of her interviews from the wedding industry. And also the Wedding Biz website, thewedingbiz.com. And my entertainment company, KushnerEntertainment.com. And please be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wedding Biz Show. And I want to mention next week's guest. It was quite a dynamic second interview with Cindy Novotny of Master Connection Associates, a wonderful and popular consultant with some just incredible tips addressing delegating and trusting employees and motivating employees. And her favorite brainstorming technique, which I'd never heard of, was interesting to me, Also talks about pricing in the industry and the whole issue, and also turning fear into a motivator. And planner, designer extraordinaire David Stark is going to be my guest co-host for the next level version of that interview, second interview with Sydney. It's going to really be incredible. I'm psyched. So thanks again for listening to The Wedding Biz.